Karen, can I say, Beth, I thanked her very much for telling everybody who I am, because not everybody always knows. Not long ago, I was coming back from China, and Chicago was the first port of entry, and I was there getting undressed for the security people. And I put my stuff down on the conveyor belt, and the lady behind me said, "So where'd you get all those screw-top bottles? My bottles all leak." And I said, "Well, I got them at the Container Store." And then I was going through the magnetometer, and the TSA guard looked at me and he said, "Oh my God, it's you." He said, "I'm from Bosnia, and we all love you in Bosnia, and if it weren't for you, there wouldn't be a Bosnia, and you're welcome in Bosnia. And can I have my picture taken with you?" So we have our picture taken, the whole line gets screwed up. I go back to get my stuff, and the lady of the screw-top bottle says, "So what exactly happened here?" And I said, "Well, I used to be Secretary of State." And she said, "Of Bosnia?" So I'm very glad.
Well, I'd like to begin by asking you, I read your book as, I really sort of viewed it, to be totally frank with you, as almost a homework assignment for this event. But it is a truly extraordinary book. It is hair-raising to read this history, your history, but also the history of Europe at that time, and to see how many failures of leadership really enabled Hitler and really led the world into World War II. But I found myself wondering, I mean, obviously you have always been interested in this era, in this part of the world. You wrote your thesis about one of the minor characters in the book. But how is this a different book, maybe, than the one you might have written before you learned, late in life, that you yourself were of Jewish heritage and had close relatives who perished in the Holocaust?
Well, I was raised a Catholic, married an Episcopalian, and found out I was Jewish. So, but in many, I had written my official memoirs, Madam Secretary, and I had begun to look at a lot of personal issues at that stage, because when I wrote that, I had found out about my Jewish background. But a lot of the book would not have been different, because I have always been interested about what happened as a lead-up to World War II and what were the lessons out of that. And so the book is basically in 3 layers. The first one is my personal story. I had always known about the Holocaust. I just didn't know that it applied to members of my own family. So I would have written about the horrors of the Holocaust no matter what, and also what it was like to be a child during World War II, and about my parents and their diplomatic background and coming to America. So that's the first layer. The second one, however, is about how decisions were made, what happened in the lead up to World War II. And the third layer is about the difficulty of making moral decisions. And so I think basically the book would have been very much the same, because people often ask me, how would I have behaved, for instance, on Bosnia? Was finding out I was Jewish had anything to do with it? Actually, Bosnia was before I found out about my Jewish background. But what my baggage always has been is being a child of World War II. And that one could say that nobody knew what was going on during the war. But later, now, thanks to you and information technology, we know what's going on everywhere. So here I was in a position where I could make a difference about something that I could not have earlier.
Well, this is a conference about leadership, and this is really very much a book about leadership. But you say, I was struck early on in the book that, first of all, you talk about recently rereading War and Peace. This is the kind of woman who rereads War and Peace. But that you really disagree with Tolstoy, who sort of sees history as being determined by the mysterious hand of providence and random events, that you really believe history is determined by leaders.
Yeah.
And as you look at the world today, there's so much scary, horrific stuff happening in Egypt, in Syria, obviously, throughout the Middle East. And when you look at the leaders in the world today, are there any lessons from that period that that you feel are applicable today?
Very much. And let me say, the reason I reread War and Peace is when I read it the first time, I only read the love scenes. and the boys read the battles, and so I thought I needed to reread it. So, but there were a lot of really great lessons in there, and some of it is this fact that Tolstoy thought everything is predetermined, and that the higher you are in office, the less you can do in terms of decision making. And I simply could not go along with that. I think that I do teach, and one of the things I teach about is how countries make foreign policy. And they're basically done on 5 factors. One is objective. Where is the country? What's its resource-based facts? The second one is subjective. How does a country feel about itself at any given time? The third factor is how the governments are organized, in our case, executive, legislative, political parties. And the fourth are bureaucratic struggles that are reflected in the budget. And the fifth is the role of individuals. So they all fit together. I think that what I learned out of writing this book, and as somebody who was born in Czechoslovakia, I always knew Munich was a horrible thing. But what I hadn't focused on was the subjective factor as well as the role of the individual. So the British and French were exhausted from World War I. They had lost a whole generation of young men. Their budget was a mess. Their military was in a mess. And Neville Chamberlain, who I always thought was an odious character, basically, I now understand a little bit better. He was going to do anything in order not to have his country go to war again. And so he sold Czechoslovakia down the river, and he basically said, why should we care about people in faraway places with unpronounceable names? So in many ways, we are not in a dissimilar situation at this point. It's always dangerous to make historical analogies because something is always a little bit different. But the bottom line is, subjectively, we are tired from Afghanistan and Iraqi wars. Our budget is a mess. Our military is being restructured. And so the question is, why should we care about people in faraway places with unpronounceable names? And I do think that there is a genuine question these days, because we do know everything that's going on everywhere. Do we have any responsibilities for what is happening in faraway places? And how do we square that with the fact that some of our objective factors are changing in terms of what the economic picture is? Do we possibly now have energy independence? A variety of things. And I think that there is a question about what individuals can do. I do believe in the role of the individual fully. Otherwise, why would you want to be what you're doing or what I have done, or all the wonderful women here, in terms of that we can make a difference? If you think it's all predetermined, then why would you come to a conference, and why would you do anything? So I can't go along with Tolstoy, though he's a great writer.
Well, speaking of, your own history here, you have, even as you were raising children, you have been in so many environments, and at a time when you were probably found yourself very often the only woman in the room, whether it was academia, presidential campaigns, the West Wing, the United Nations, or as the first woman Secretary of State ever. I mean, none of these are environments that historically have been particularly open or welcoming to women. Which of those did you find the most challenging, and do you have any advice for women here in terms of what it really takes to make yourself heard in settings where people aren't really used to listening to women?
Well, let me say, I'm very old. I was born at some point between the invention of the iPod and the discovery of fire. So my experience is a little bit different from people. But I wanted to be a journalist. And I had been one of the editors of my college paper, and while my husband was in the Army, I worked in a small newspaper in Missouri. And when we moved back to Chicago, my husband was already employed by a newspaper. We were having dinner with his managing editor, and he said, "So what are you going to do, honey?" And I said, "I'm going to be a journalist." And he said, "I don't think so, because you can't work on the same paper as your husband because of guild regulations. and you wouldn't want to compete with your husband, even though there were 3 other papers in Chicago. And instead of saying what I might say today or what everybody here would say, I saluted and started down a different path. So that was fairly off-putting at age 22.
Oh my gosh, you're a failed journalist?
I'm a failed journalist. But I think that the thing throughout my life, all the things you've described, I was pretty much the only woman. And the thing that happened, and I bet everybody's had this same experience, is you're in a meeting and you think, well, I think I'll say this. And then you think, no, I won't. It's really stupid sounding. And then some man says it, and the whole discussion is about, as Bill said, and you think, damn it, why didn't I say that? I think we can all identify with that. And so I had made up my mind that I would always speak in meetings, and which I think requires something I made up, which is called active listening, if you're really going to interrupt. And you have to know what you're talking about, and you have to have a really strong voice to do it. So this was my lesson. Then I end up at the United Nations, and I'm at the Security Council, 15 members, 14 men sitting there like that, looking at me. And I thought, well, maybe I won't speak today. I have to figure out if people like me or, who these people are. And then I looked at a sign that said United States. And I thought, if I don't speak today, the voice of the United States will not be heard. And so I had kind of an out-of-body experience thinking, I have to do what I say that women should do, and that is interrupt. I really do believe that the most important thing we have to do is interrupt. But if you're going to interrupt, then you have to know what you're talking about. And so the lesson out of this, I have to say, and I'm sure everybody here knows this, women do have to work much, much harder than men. There is plenty of room in the world for mediocre men. There is no room for mediocre women.
So which of these environments turned out to be the toughest to sort of crack and make your voice heard?
Well, it's interesting, now I have to tell you, my granddaughter, when she's now 11, but when she was 7, said to her mother, what is the big deal about Grandma Maddie being Secretary of State? Only girls are Secretary of State. So in her lifetime, that was true. But when my name was even mentioned to be Secretary of State, people said a woman could not be Secretary of State, that especially Arab men would not deal with a woman Secretary of State. And so I had been at the UN, and the Arab ambassadors there got together and said we had no problem dealing with Ambassador Albright. We wouldn't have any problem with Secretary Albright. So that argument went away. And by the way, I would never have been Secretary of State if it hadn't been for Hillary. And the reason I know that and the reason I know that is President Clinton said so publicly while we were abroad. We used to do this thing where I would introduce her, she would introduce him. And then he gets up and he says, Madeleine's name was mentioned and Hillary came to me, he said, and said, why wouldn't you name Madeleine? She's the one that is most in tune with your views, expresses them better than anybody else, and besides, it would make your mother happy. So that is, So what happens is I go on my first trip abroad. I do go to the Gulf states in a very large plane that says United States of America. And when the meeting is over, I said to the others, thank you very much. Perhaps you've noticed I'm not dressed the same way that my predecessors had been, and you're very kind, and next time we'll talk about women's rights. And we did. I had more problem with the men in our own government. Not because they were all male chauvinist pigs, but because they had seen me through this very long career I had. I had been a carpool mother or a friend of their wife's or cooked dinner for them. I was a staffer for Senator Muskie. I made a lot of coffee. I Xeroxed a lot. And all of a sudden there I am, and they thought, how did she get to be Secretary of State when I should be Secretary of State? So some of the harder meetings that I actually had were inside the Situation Room. Where when I talked about Bosnia, because I was at the UN, and I saw more foreigners than any other American diplomat, and they kept saying, do something, and I would come into the Situation Room and state my views about it, and I was told not to be so emotional. So I really did have a harder time often within American circles.
Well, I think one thing people maybe don't realize is that your successor, Condoleezza Rice, actually that your father was her academic mentor.
We learned different things.
Yes, you did learn different things. But that I keep thinking back, there's a sort of famous story that when Condi Rice went to visit Gaddafi, he took her back into the kitchen where the women were and then gave her a piece of jewelry and offered to help her find a Libyan husband. Did you ever encounter that sort of thing in that part of the world? And also, did you find that it was, that we just sort of assume that people there have our same values? And, did you ever tumble into any sort of pitfalls in that regard?
Well, not similar to that, but I did find that it was sometimes difficult to have some leaders take me seriously, I think, or patronize, or be. For instance, I think one of the worst meetings I had was with Milosevic, the Serbian, and probably because he thought he could charm me, and he started criticizing what we were doing and acting as if I had no conception of what the issues were. And I finally said, I know the history very well. I've lived in this country. And so in many ways, you kind of have to push back and not put up with it. But I didn't have the same kind of issues that Condi did on that. What we did, I was very interested in listening earlier this morning about the importance of makeup and what you wear. People asked me what was the difference between a male and female Secretary of State, and I said makeup. But all three of us have had people criticize what we wore, what our hair looks like, and various aspects that are basically patronizing. But I fortunately didn't have the same kind of experience that Condi did.
One of the issues that we hear talked about a lot in foreign policy these days is the status of women around the world. And I was wondering, there was a lot of, emphasis, I think, early in Secretary Clinton's tenure on the status of Afghan women. And now as we've moved along, if you keep reading that there actually is a lot of backsliding going on in Afghanistan, and that ultimately other foreign policy priorities are sort of taking precedence. Is this something that is inevitable, and how do you make sure, or do you need to make sure, that the status of women in other parts of the world is really written into our own foreign policy?
Well, first of all, I think that we have to recognize the fact that how women are treated in societies is an indication of how stable the societies are. And I was the first woman to put women's issues central to American foreign policy, not just because I'm a feminist, but because out of just understanding what happens when women are politically and economically empowered, how societies change. So it's in U.S. national interest to have these kinds of societies. That's for starters. Then I went, when I was in office, I went to Peshawar, where there was a refugee camp, and a lot of women that had come out of Afghanistan. And their stories were absolutely unbelievable of people. This young woman, I remember talking about how her sister had jumped out of a window to avoid being raped. And everybody had just horrible stories about what had happened to them in Afghanistan. I was criticized because we would not recognize, when I was in office, we would not recognize the Taliban because of what they were doing to women, and it created a very complicated situation in Afghanistan. And I remember people saying, why are you not, why don't we do something different? So my sense is that I think it would be I would like to see peace in Afghanistan. I think we've expended a lot of blood and treasure, and the people of Afghanistan deserve peace, but it can't be done on the backs of the women. And I think that is something that we have to understand as we have the negotiations. I do think that one of the issues that we all have to think about is that women need to be treated with respect in their societies, and that women's rights are absolutely essential because, as Hillary said, women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. I think the thing we have to understand, though, is that things are different in a variety of countries. And I was telling you earlier, I have made some mistakes. I definitely have, in terms of mirror imaging too much about things and not fully understanding what some women in some countries want. And there was a picture in the paper actually today of Turkey, and there is a woman coming into their parliament covered. And it is a big change because the Turks used to not allow any covered women in their parliaments. So I remembered I was in Turkey a couple of years ago with a women's audience, and some of the women were covered and some were not. And I was asked a question as to what did I think, should women be covered or not? So I gave my wonderful American answer. I said, women have to, for me, choice is the word about everything to do with women, and so women need to have the choice to decide whether they want to be covered or not. And all of a sudden, these women came up and said that was the wrong answer, because the women that were covered said, why didn't you say we should be covered? And the women that were uncovered said, why didn't you say we should be uncovered? And so sometimes you think you're saying the right thing, and yet you don't fully kind of plug into what is going on somewhere. But there's just essential aspect to this, that women need to be politically and economically empowered in their societies because it makes societies more stable. Education issues are raised, health, there's no question. And so we have to continue to do that. And then of course, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help each other, which means that we'll all see each other. So we'll all see each other in the other place.
Right. Well, speaking of women in parliaments, if you look at our parliament, it doesn't have such a great record. I mean, I think we're something like 78th in the world in the percentage of women who are in our Congress compared to other countries, including, countries that we often think of as sort of more backwards than our own. And when you talk to political scientists, they say that women actually do quite well, relatively speaking, when they run for office, but there are just not enough of them willing to stand up and do that. Why do you think that is?
Well, we always like to be number one in everything, and we're definitely not in this. And I find it most unfortunate. I think that partially that there's not enough support at the lower levels in terms of it's not. I have only one regret in life, which is that I never ran for public office. And
not too late.
Well, I don't know. But I do think that we need to be more supportive of women at lower levels so that they are there in a way of understanding what public service is about and wanting to be there and have the opportunities to get up there and things. I think what is interesting is the number of women that are in Congress now, and during this last episode with the budget and things, it was actually the women in Congress of both parties that were able to reach across the aisle and put forward some useful ideas. So I do think that women, in fact, do make a difference when they are in public office. One of the things that I think we always have trouble with, in some of the Scandinavian countries, there are quotas for women. A certain number have to be elected. Americans don't like the word quota. And so I think we have to go about it in some other way and really be supportive of women that want to run for public office, that have views that are similar to ours. I have to say there are some women I would not vote for because I don't agree with their positions at all. I would prefer to vote for a man that believes in choice. And so I think that we need to figure that out.
Well, it looks like we are running out of time here, judging by my little reminder down there. So I just want to thank you so much for your time this morning, for your insights. And this book is like really, really good. So go read it.
With that. And I would like to thank everybody who's here. This is an amazing session, and I think it shows the strength that we have as women when we understand each other, when we support each other, when we interrupt. I definitely am up for interrupting. My classes are a bit of a zoo because I tell people not to raise their hands. But I do think the power that we have to do the correct thing and to really be politically and economically empowered makes a huge difference. So hats off to all of you. Thank you very, very much. Yeah.